Imagine you lived your entire life in absolute paradise. Every need met, every provision made for you in advance. Then one day, you do the one thing you were told not to do. This one rule was about a single tree and its fruit. But sadly, you were deceived, convinced you needed to be something you already were. What you did not know was that this rule was not put in place to exclude you from something, like the accuser tried to make you believe. You'll be like God, the liar said. But you were already made to be like him, made in his image. The accuser said, God is holding out on you. He is keeping wisdom from you. At that moment, a tree that you barely ever looked at became more and more beautiful. Its fruit looked more and more delicious. And that is when you were convinced. You bought what the swindler was selling, but you did not read the fine print. And what you got was not what you thought you were buying. Instead of wisdom, you were face to face with feelings you had never felt before: shame, fear, guilt, and so much more. Because of these feelings, you tried to hide. You tried to make yourself invisible. But no matter how deep you went into the trees, God knew where you were. In his mercy, he gave you a chance to come clean, to be honest. But that's not what happened. You blamed another person. You tried to convince God that someone else made you disobey, instead of admitting it was your choice. God didn't buy your lies. He punished you and banished you from paradise. But the banishment was not cruel. It was actually his mercy. God placed a creature to block your way from going back into your paradise home. A monumental flaming sword blocked your path to immortality. But what is so much more important than this? God already had a plan for redemption and salvation. God would send a Savior who would crush the head of the very serpent that deceived you. That is where we left Adam and Eve at the end of chapter 3. And today we are about to explore chapter 4. Hey guys, before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that Exploring the Bible has a merch shop. And season 1 and season 2 stuff is up and ready for you guys to buy. We've got t-shirts and mugs, and I think we have a mouse pad and a bunch of other cool stuff. And remember, anything you purchase from the merch shop helps to support this podcast and helps it to keep going. I am grateful for your support. Now, let's get back to the episode. Welcome to another episode of Exploring the Bible. If you are new here, we go from Genesis to Revelations, looking at the narrative stories to see what we can learn, so we can see the warnings and the wisdom, but most importantly, God's love and mercy in every single step of the way. I am so glad you are here. And if this is not your first episode, and if you are returning to listen, thank you so much. Truly, your support means the world to me. And I hope that every time you tune in, you walk away feeling closer to God and a little more equipped to understand his word. Today we are beginning Genesis chapter 4. This is part 2 of Adam and Eve's narrative story. We are about to be introduced to the children of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. But before we jump into their story, I want to take us a step back. I want us to look at the world Adam and Eve are living in before Cain and Abel even arrive on the scene. Because I think sometimes we skip past that. And when we do, we miss something that's really important. So let's go back for a moment to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And God gave humans 2 specific jobs in these chapters. In the first job, it was found in Genesis 1:26. And God said that humans would rule over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. In other words, God gave humans the responsibility of taking care of and ruling over the animals. Then in Genesis 2:4, God gave humans a second job. The text tells us there is no people to cultivate the ground. God was signaling that humans were also meant to plant things and to tend to the earth and care for the land. Now, we can look at these jobs in two different ways. The first is straightforward. These were things that God had planned humans to do in the Garden of Eden. And that is absolutely true. But I want to offer you another lens, another way of seeing it. And that is God, in his infinite knowledge, was preparing them for their future. God knows all things. He knew what was coming. He knew that the fall would happen. So, from the very beginning, he was equipping Adam and Eve with these skills, the skills that they needed to know for the other side of Eden. We see this confirmed in Genesis 3:23, when God tells us that he sent Adam out to cultivate the ground. And just like that, outside of the garden, those skills that God had instilled in them became their survival. So from that moment forward, Adam and Eve had to do things on their own. Now that God had banished them from Eden, they had to do things on their own. They needed to find shelter. They needed to figure out where to plant food. They needed to protect themselves. Because unlike the garden, where everything had been provided for them, now they had to provide for themselves. But here is something I really want us to hold on to. And I think this is so easy for us to miss when we read this story. Yes, they are outside the garden. And yes, things are harder. But God did not just throw them out into a barren wasteland and walk away. Look at what was still around them. God created the land, Genesis 1:9-10. The rivers were flowing through the land, Genesis 2:10-14. There was vegetation and plant life all over the earth, Genesis 1:11-12. There were animals everywhere, Genesis 1:21-23. Adam and Eve were not left with nothing. They were surrounded by the provision of God, even in their consequence. The land was there, the water was there, the food was there, the animals were there. They just had to work for it now. And yes, things were harder. Everything they had to do took more effort than it did in the garden. But they were not abandoned. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because I think it speaks directly to our lives also. Even in our hardest seasons, even in the middle of our consequences, God does not strip us of everything. His provision is still there. It just might look different than it did before. I want us to use our imagination for a moment. Picture Adam and Eve navigating this new life. Maybe they found a cave. Maybe Adam learned to build a basic shelter from the things around him. We see Adam beginning to domesticate animals, learning how to work with them. We see him cultivate the ground, planting and watering and harvesting everything from scratch. And I want to pause here and say something that I think we often overlook. When we read this part of the story, we live in 2026. And if you want to learn to build something, you can just open up YouTube. There's a video for that. If you want to know what to expect during pregnancy, you can read a book like What to Expect When You're Expecting. You can see doctors, nurses, midwives, and other professionals. You can take classes. You can call your mother or your grandmother or your best friend who had already been through it. You can look up what milestones your baby should be hitting at every stage of development. But Eve did not have any of that. She did not have a doctor to walk her through what was happening in her body as the baby grew. She did not have anyone to explain why she was feeling the way she was feeling. She did not have a community of women who had gone through it before her, who could say, that's normal. It's just a part of it. There was no one, because she was the first. There was literally no one who had come before her. If you need to learn a skill, building, farming, shepherding, there is someone who came before you, but not for Adam and Eve. They were writing the book as they lived it. And I think this is worth pausing to give honor to this moment. The resilience that this must have taken, the faith that this must have required. But here is something even harder than all of that. Something I think we gloss over every time we read this story. Probably the hardest thing of all was that Adam and Eve had lost their face to face relationship with God. He was no longer as accessible as he had been in the garden. They could no longer walk with him in the cool of the day the way that the text implies that they once did. And that loss, that relational loss, must have been devastating in a way that no amount of difficulty farming or building could ever compare to. Think about that. Everything else was hard, but losing closeness with God, that must have been the hardest, deepest grief of all. And yet, despite all of that, despite the grief and the difficulty and the completely uncharted territory that they were navigating every single day, life continued. God's plan moved forward. In Genesis 4:1 says, "Now Adam had sexual relations with his wife Eve. She became pregnant. She gave birth to Cain. And she said, 'With the Lord's help, I have produced a man.'" I want us to stop here because I think there is something in what Eve says that we really need to pay attention to. And honestly, I think it's something we need to learn from. Eve did not say, "Look what I did." She did not say, "Look at what Adam and I accomplished." She gave credit to God. "With God's help, I produced a man." Now think about that in context. This woman who was punished, this woman who was banished from the only home she had ever known, this woman who lost her daily face to face access to the God who created her, she had every earthly reason to be bitter, every earthly reason to be mad at God. In one of the most vulnerable, life changing moments in her life, her first response was to acknowledge God. I want us to sit with that. How often do we do the opposite? How often, when we are going through something hard, do we find ourselves asking, "Why did God let this happen? Why did He cause this? Why is He doing this to me?" Believe me, I've been there. I think we all have. And here is what I want to say about that. It is okay to be upset. It really is. God is not fragile. He can handle your feelings. You can go to him and tell him exactly what you are feeling and why. He already knows it anyway. He has no problem with us being honest about our pain. But here's the difference between being upset and being angry at God. Using that anger against him, blaming him for things that sin brought into the world. God does not cause bad things to happen. Sin causes bad things to happen. That goes all the way back to the garden. So, like Eve, even in our hardest moments, let's try to look for what God is doing rather than blaming him for what went wrong. And as another little side note, I was thinking about this while preparing for this episode. I've had 3 kids, and every single time I had people around me, a doctor telling me how far along I was, other moms who had been through it before me, information everywhere about what to expect. Eve had none of that, and still she praised God in the middle of it. That right there is the kind of faith that challenges me deeply, and I hope it challenges you too. Life kept moving. Genesis 4:2 tells us, "Later she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel." And then, just a few words later, we get a beautiful picture of these two boys growing up. The second half of Genesis 4:2 says, "When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground." Let's think about what that tells us. First, Adam and Eve are still alive. Cain and Abel grew up. That means that they found shelter, they found food, and they figured things out. Day by day, one season at a time, God's provision carried them through. But second, and this is a part that really gets me, look at what Cain and Abel are doing. Abel is a shepherd and Cain is a farmer. These are the exact two jobs that God gave human beings back in Genesis 1 and 2, ruling over animals and cultivating the ground. Adam and Eve did not just survive, they taught. They passed down what God had already given them. They looked at their sons and said, "Here is what I know. Here is what God showed me. And here is how to tend the land and care for animals." The knowledge did not die with them, it was transferred to the next generation. And I think that is one of the most beautiful, quiet moments in this whole story because it tells us that Adam and Eve remained faithful to what God had given them, even after everything that they had been through, even after the garden, even after shame and the banishment and the grief. They held on to what God had placed in their hands, and they gave it to their children. One more thing that Adam and Eve passed down to their sons, and it might be the most important thing of all. Genesis 4:3-4 says, "When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portion of his firstborn lambs from his flock." I'm going to hold off on the second half of Genesis 4:4 because this is going to be the focus of our next episode. But what I want you to see right here is Adam and Eve taught their children to worship God. Even though they were no longer in the garden, even though they no longer walked with God face to face, even though they had been banished and punished, and living a harder life than they could ever have imagined, they still worshiped. They still raised their sons who worshiped. And that is not a small thing. That is an act of incredible faithful love towards a God they could not see anymore the way they once had. Okay, friends, you know this is my favorite part of every episode, the what now part. What do we do with what we have just learned? We have been given a picture of a family, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, navigating life after the garden. But what does that mean for us? What do we take with us when this episode is over? I have two key lessons that I want to leave us with today. Lesson number one is God always provides, even in the hard times. I know how easy it is when you are in the middle of something really difficult to see only the difficulty, to feel like you have nothing, to look at your situation and wonder, where is God in all of it? I've been there. There have been seasons of my own life where I was struggling to put food on the table. And I remember going to the food bank and feeling embarrassment, like I couldn't feed my own family. I felt low. I felt like things were just falling apart. And in those moments, it was so easy to focus on the struggle and to forget about the blessing that was sitting right in front of me. Because that food bank was a blessing. That was God providing for me through other people, through community, through the systems He had put in place in the world so that when I needed it, I would not go without. We do that so often. We focus on what we do not have and forget to thank God for what we do have. Adam and Eve had every reason to feel that way too. They had lost so much, but had not left them without resources. The land was there, the rivers were there, the animals were there. The food grew out of the ground, they worked. And He never stopped providing for them. He just changed the form the provision took. And that is something I want us to really hold on to. God's provision does not always look the same as it did before. Sometimes it looks different. Sometimes it comes through unexpected channels. But it is still there. And most importantly, even in the hard times, God loves us. That never changes. Lesson 2. God gives us what we need to do what He calls us to do. My whole life, people have told me I talk too much. I'm too loud. I have too much to say. I always seem to get in trouble for not being able to keep my mouth shut. But God had a plan for that. Because he gave me this gift, this ability to talk, to explain, to communicate, so that one day I could sit here and tell you about the Bible. It took me a long time to see that. For years, what felt like a flaw was actually a feature. God just had a specific purpose for it that I could not see yet. God did the same thing with Adam and Eve. Before they ever left the garden, he taught Adam how to cultivate the land. He gave them both the understanding that they were to rule over and care for the animals. Those were not random instructions, they were in preparation. God was equipping them for the life they were about to have to live. God does not set us up to fail. He does not call us to something and then leave us without the tools to do it. He does not send us out empty handed. Whatever God has placed in your life, whatever skills, whatever personality traits, whatever experiences, He can use it. He is already using it, even if you can't see it yet. Trust the tools He has put in your hands. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Exploring the Bible. Today we were introduced to the family of Adam and Eve and their sons Cain and Abel. We saw how Adam and Eve navigated life outside of the garden with resilience and faith. We saw them pass their skills and their worship to God down to the next generation. And we saw that God never stopped providing for them, even when everything looked different than it once had. But we are not done with this story. Not even close. What about the second half of Genesis 4:4? What is the difference between what Cain brought and what Abel brought? And why does it matter? Why does God look at Cain and ask, "Why are you so angry?" Join me next time as we continue to explore the narrative of Cain and Abel. And things are about to get really real, really fast. If you enjoyed this episode, or any other episode, please follow this podcast wherever you are listening. And if you have a moment, leave a review. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going after every episode ends. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded of God's love for them today, please share this with them. You never know what one episode might do for someone who needs it. And as always, God bless.